Hello, I'm Dr. Ian Kenvin from the Evexia Foundation, and this is a virtual Lifebelt for Turbulent Times. Today's Lifebelt is going to be looking at the issue of projection, and what we're saying here is understanding projection can see yourself and others with greater clarity. Please, it's really important that you read and understand the disclaimer statement that's here. So, what we're going to cover in today's talk is to consider the psychological idea of projection. We're going to then reflect on how that might inform an understanding of our own and the behaviour of others. We're going to think about how we can take this idea of projection to illuminate how we see other people behaving. We're going to consider if a more mindful approach could address some of the issues of projection, and we're going to conclude with a review, a reflection and resolution. So, without further ado, let's move on. What is projection? And again, there are various ways in which we see projection, but essentially in its most basic form, it's a defense mechanism where a person denies the existence of qualities or impulses in themselves, both positive and negative, and attributes or projects those onto others. So understanding feelings or emotions can be projected onto someone or something else rather than admitting or dealing with those unwanted feelings in ourselves. So, you know, I think this was worth sort of spending a little bit more time thinking about here. And we also refer back to our film that we made looking at anxiety and in particular stress. We talked about how people have a stress container, and when that stress container fills up, it spills over, and we get a situation where people have kind of emotional snapping, and that sometimes the behaviour that they exhibit is a flare behaviour. It's to do with anxiety and, to a large extent, indignation that can sometimes occur within the body. In terms of thinking about projection, it becomes an opportunity for us to understand maybe some of those flash moments with a little greater clarity. Now, I think it's also important to say that it is significant that we need to acknowledge the existence of righteous indignation or righteous anger. So some of the ways in which people behave, you know, we have to call them out as being unacceptable. We have currently the issue of Black Lives Matter, the idea of kind of structural racism. Well, that's wrong. And I think it's quite legitimate to feel righteous indignation or righteous anger about that. Likewise with sexual exploitation and the Me Too movement. So, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge that there can be righteous anger, righteous indignation, but also we can sometimes see that we project things onto others, or we have a flare moment that maybe isn't based in our rational or our human mind. It comes flashing out of our limbic system, if you like, from the last film. It comes from our monkey mind. So how can we understand that flash and how that occurs? We also have some interesting issues here about things like confirmation bias, which can tend to make projection more legitimized by our psychology. So, for example, an example of a confirmation bias might be that some individuals who drive BMW cars might have poor impulse control and might have poor empathy towards other road users. Confirmation bias would say when we see somebody behaving in that way, oh look, it's a BMW driver, therefore all BMW drivers must behave in that way. It's illogical, but confirmation bias would tend to make that so. So yeah, we need to be aware, and one of the things we're going to drill down into is how much projection is in the realm of stereotype and in the realm of irrational but deeply embedded behaviours. So this is going to be quite a challenging subject to look at, because it does require us to do some inward reflection. So this is the first point at which I'd like us to do a little bit of reflection, a little bit of interaction. In a minute, I'd like you to pause this movie and to just to stop and ask yourself some of these questions. And what I'd like you to do is to think about, what are the occasions when you find yourself irritated or enraged by the behaviour of others, and list those out. The other thing, once you've got that list beginning to evolve, is, are you seeing that the objects of your irritation are constant? Are they situation specific? And what happens when you present yourself with the challenge of stepping back from your initial flare response, stepping back from the monkey mind response and trying to get into a more human mind response? This has been really nicely captured by somebody who's saying, can I stop and actually look at what's happening with my curiosity? Can we look at that rather than thinking, oh, it's always like that? Can we use curiosity to maybe do a little bit of self-analysis? How do you justify your behaviour to yourself and with others? And how do you take criticism? How do you feel when you feel yourself to have been criticised or judged? Again, quite a challenge here, because do you then feel negative feelings within yourself, but you project that onto others or to another situation? And it's worth thinking about, what are your physical feelings in these situations? How do you see others? What happens when you see others behaving in the same way? So a lot to think about here. So I'd like you to press pause, make those lists, do that reflection, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so I hope you found that interesting. Now, I think we need to just unpack this idea of projection a little bit more. We first find it presented, it's coined in the late 19th century, and it came from the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, in a paper he wrote in 1898. Usually it's about the externalizations of a person's negative traits that and that list can be extensive, but it's essential. It's about placing the blame outside ourselves, placing the blame onto an outside force, an outside individual, an outside generalized other. So it can be the workplace, it can be the government, can be the environment. So, it's an extensive list. It is essentially a defense against stress. So it's hardly surprising in these turbulent times, we may be finding we are flaring and we are seeing other people flaring. So let's look at that a little bit further. You might want to think about, okay, conversations that ascribe blame or fault. So let's talk about the boss in a workplace. We spend about 60% of our life in the workplace, so very often when we have situations where people say, oh, my boss is toxic, my workplace is toxic, yes, you might have a boss who has kind of low emotional intelligence, who's a bit brusque. You might be working in an organisation that doesn't have many kind of more empathetic qualities in its work culture. But quite often what we find is when you look at, okay, the person who is claiming the workplace is making them ill, if you actually do some analysis, you actually find that that person may have a real problematic home life, might have issues in their social environment, which causes them problems. But rather than admitting the issues in their home life or in the social setting, they project all the negative things onto the workplace and the boss, if you like. We can also see this example when people talk about the council. The council as being, behaving in a stupid way, behaving in an inhumane way. But a council, doesn't have consciousness. It's just an amalgam of people making a bunch of decisions. Yeah. There's been some very interesting work on projection and road rage. So, is it the other driver? It's the other driver's fault. It's the other driver who causes you to develop righteous indignation. And whilst we've acknowledged righteous indignation might exist, does it actually occur on the road? Does it make sense? Is it logical? Maybe not. You then can look at things like, well, sometimes you can find your anger flaring with strangers. Is somebody invading your personal space? Has somebody come too close to you? You can also find sometimes with neighbour disputes that, quite often you'll find that people who have serial disputes with their neighbours are themselves looking to find the negative, looking to find fault with other people rather than looking inward and thinking about themselves. So as you see, it's quite complex. Now, if we can take this a step further, you can see it can be about objectifying people who are other. And again, we see this a lot. Contemporary examples of this might come from things like some of the statements of the odious Donald Trump, or some of the statements of the odious Daily Mail, blaming all ills upon immigrants. Yeah? Think of some of the issues which are very contemporary at the moment for people of colour, and the lack of acknowledgement of structural institutional racism. You can then take that a little bit further and say, what about people who are non-gender normative? How often are they the objects of hate and hate crimes? In a similar sort of way, we can also see this, well, what about when we ascribe qualities to people from a different region? Yorkshire and Lancashire, red rose and white rose, still fighting the War of the Roses, 400 years later. Or the idea that people from Ireland are not very clever, or people from Scotland are miserly. It doesn't make sense. But these are perpetuating myths. What about we take this now then and think about people who support different football teams from you? Manchester City, Manchester United, Everton, Liverpool, Cardiff City and Swansea, places where there's no real logic, but the people who support those football teams, everybody who supports Millwall seems to hate everybody else. There's no real logic to it, but it is a perpetuating myth. And again, you can probably come up with your own quite extensive list there. So I think we need to unpack this a little bit more. Are those stereotypes in any way logical, in any way rooted in reality? Now, I've mentioned the idea of confirmation bias earlier on, but we do seem to see that there are persistent projections across all of human society. And we take a historical view, we see it happen historically, we can see it happen within faith groups, for example, Protestants and Catholics. We can see it in Islam between Sunni and Shia. These seem to be persistent problems. And we need to think about, well, why is it then that some people seem to explode? Some people seem to be filled with, justified to them, what they see as righteous indignation. It's a concept I've called here the world police effect. So you'll find, I've certainly encountered, as a cyclist, encountered drivers who set themselves up as the world police because some cyclists jump red lights. Therefore, those drivers feel righteous indignation, therefore objectify and hate all cyclists. Forgetting that those cyclists are human beings, they simply become objectified into a depersonalized object to hate. And you often find when you discuss that, and I've had some very robust discussions with drivers when I've been out on my bicycle, and often that driver is the self-appointed guardian of the right. So again, we see it in road rage, I've mentioned before. We've also seen it in things like what I've broadly called trolley wars. Think about what's happened in some supermarkets where people literally fighting over the last loaf of bread on the shelf, or the last particular thing that they wanted to get, and they see somebody in front of them, so they will behave in a very, very aggressive manner. So, I think that if we think about this, we see it around us quite often. And what I'd like to do is to suggest that maybe mindfulness, taking a more mindful approach, will give us an opportunity for some honest infrastructure, some honest introspection, if you like. The mindful approach would say, well, why am I reacting? Is what I'm reacting to an authentic fact, or is it something that has come out of my psychology? Am I responding like this out of habit? Can I see that there might be another explanation? Can I use my curiosity to think, can I think about this differently? Because again, it's really hard to be honestly mindful, to be truly mindful. And one of the key reasons is that we're dealing with the ego here, and the ego is extremely tricksy. The ego does not wish to be analysed. It's a tricksy thing. It'll keep moving, it'll keep morphing, keep changing. Yeah? And it's also because people do not wish to be, to acknowledge that they might have negative or ignoble qualities. The point I've talked about here is that we all like to be the heroes of our personal mythology, and that our way to deny our anti-heroic qualities would be to project them onto others. Okay, so a lot to think about there. This is another point where I'd like you just to pause for a moment. So what I'd like you to do in a moment is to press the pause button, and I'd like you to have a think about some of the points that I've mentioned here. Yes, we acknowledge that being honest with yourself is hard and it's challenging. And you may have been rationalizing your projection for a long time. It might be something that you've assimilated from early childhood, or from within your family, within your social group, within your ethnic group. Has it become a habit? And in particular, these are habits which are very hard to break. So look at your earlier list of situations and the individuals that cause you to flare. Can you now empathise or consider another way of looking at those situations? Can you confront your own negative aspects and break your projection behaviours by having greater awareness of your trigger points? And the understanding of the trigger points becomes very important, and it's something we have looked at in earlier films. So have a think about that. There's a lot going on there, big challenge. Press pause, and when you've got most of the things down there, play and we'll carry on. Okay, so I hope you found that interesting. What I'd like to do now is to look at practical things that we can do, practical actions that we can do when we feel ourselves flaring, when we can feel that rush of anger, be it that projected or otherwise. What can we do? And again, this is something which we've touched on before, but I'd like to repeat. Breath is really important. Breath can bring us back to the moment. So in its simplest way, I would say take 3 deep breaths. When you breathe in calm. When you breathe out anger. Breathe in positive, breathe out negative. If you want to take this a step further, one of the things which is advocated for some of the blue light services when they are being a bit more restrained is what's called square breathing. So you would breathe in for a count of 3, hold for a count of 3, breathe out for a count of 3, stay empty for a count of 3, breathe in, hold, out. Yes? So you're breathing in 4 sides, breathing in a square. That can work really, really well. The other thing that you should do in that flaring moment is to think about tip. And again, I've mentioned tip before, but it's worth bearing in mind. Tip is about that anger moment, that flash of emotion. And what you need to do in that flash of emotion is think about tip. T is temperature. You literally need to cool down because you are very much in reality getting hot under the collar. Your circulation is pumping, your blood is pumping. You are literally getting hot. You are getting ready to fight or to flee. The I is intense activity. What you need to do is to find some way of taking up that burst of energy, because that burst of energy will be coming along to you. If you bottle it up, it won't be good. You need to do something with it, and you need to do something which is of appropriate intensity. So, go for a brisk walk, go for a run, dance, do something, garden with great vigor, go and do the weeding or something, but something which is properly intense and allows you to do something outside of that situation. And then the P is be present, be in the moment. Yeah? Ask yourself the question, as it says here, am I reacting like this because of things that have happened in the past? Is there some other way of thinking about this? Can I acknowledge a different way of thinking about how I'm feeling at the moment? It's that idea of, can I engage mindfully? Can I use my curiosity to look at this and look at how I'm feeling? Okay, so those are practical actions. So what I'd like to do now is just to return to our objectives. So we said at the beginning we'd consider the psychological idea of projection. I think we've explored that quite a lot. We've asked you to reflect on, does that inform how we can understand our own behaviour? Is thinking about projection does it help us to illuminate how others behaving? And can we give ourselves the opportunity to contemplate a more mindful approach? Could being more mindful allow us to deal with some of the issues that sit within projection? And I think we've explored that quite a lot. Our conclusion is to think about as I've said here, reflection, revelations and resolutions. So what I'd like you to do finally is to reflect reflect on what I've talked about, reflect upon your responses. Have there been any kind of aha moments? Have there been any moments where you can see, oh yes, if I'm honest, I can see me behaving in that way? Or now I think about it, when I see other people behaving in a particular way, yes, they may be projecting, they may be flaring. Yeah, so that becomes quite important in terms of reflection. Again, make a note of any clarifications, because there will be opportunities to clarify points with the associated webinar from this talk. And finally, make yourself some resolutions. Resolutions become more powerful if you express them. You can write them down, write them on a mirror with a lipstick, make a vlog, make a poster, you know, do something which captures and says, okay, in the future I resolve to behave in this particular way in these situations. Now, as ever, some of the thinking that we've been through here may trigger some quite difficult thoughts for you. So we have given you a whole series of helplines that can give you further information. But essentially, this has been a virtual life belt considering the issue of projection, and I have been Dr. Ian Kenvin. Thank you very much.